She didn't know the coffee shop she'd built from nothing would be the last ordinary thing she'd ever own. At 31, Nessa Callahan had learned to measure her life in small victories. The morning rush at Bean and Birch. The sound of her daughter singing off-key in the back room while Nessa counted the register. The particular quiet of 4 a.m. when she rose before the rest of the world and felt, briefly, like someone who had things under control. Then her brother walked through the front door with a man she'd never seen before, and everything she'd built in the last 4 years started to come apart at the seams. His name was Hale, and he wasn't there for coffee. Nessa had opened Bean and Birch the year after Jonah's father left. Not because she'd always dreamed of running a cafe, but because she needed something that was entirely hers. Something no one could take a half share of in a custody arrangement or split down the middle in a settlement. She'd taken out a loan, painted the walls herself, learned to make a decent croissant through sheer stubborn repetition, and built a small, steady life in a city that rewarded neither sentimentality nor failure. Portland had been good to her. Not generous, not easy, but good in the specific way of places that don't ask about your past and don't care who you used to be. She'd made friends, regulars. She'd learned the name of every dog that came through the door on weekend mornings, and that the retired professor who sat in the corner booth every Tuesday took his Americano with exactly 2 sugars and a quiet that needed no interruption. Jonah was 4 when she opened the shop, and he was 8 now, and he still did his homework at the corner table every afternoon, eating the slightly imperfect pastries she set aside for him because they had small cracks or lopsided shapes that wouldn't sell. He never minded. He called them the best ones. She was, by every measure that mattered to her, fine. Until she wasn't. Her brother's name was Declan. Not from the list. Declan was the one she'd always forgiven too easily, the one who borrowed money and paid it back late and looked so genuinely sorry about it every time that she kept letting him back in. He was 3 years older and about 3 decades less responsible, and she loved him in the exhausted, resigned way you love someone who keeps almost drowning. He came in on a Tuesday. Cold November, the kind that made Portland feel like the world had forgotten it was supposed to warm back up. She was wiping down the espresso machine when the bell above the door rang, and she looked up expecting a customer and got her brother instead, wearing a jacket that was too thin for the weather and an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not guilt, not sheepishness, not the particular rueful look he wore when he needed something, fear. The man behind him didn't come inside immediately. He stood in the doorway for a moment, hands in the pockets of a coat that probably cost more than her rent, looking at the cafe the way people look at rooms they are deciding whether or not to occupy permanently. Not admiring, assessing. He was tall, somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that had been attractive once and was now something more severe. A jaw that could have been carved from something harder than bone, eyes the particular gray of lake water before a storm. He wasn't handsome in the soft, approachable way Nessa had been drawn to when she was younger. He was handsome the way certain things were dangerous, with a kind of authority that wasn't performed. Nessa. Declan's voice came out too quiet. I need you to hear me out. She already knew she wasn't going to like what came next. The man's name was Hale. That much Declan gave her before his voice cracked and he looked at the floor. The rest came out in fragments, and Nessa had to piece it together the way you piece together the aftermath of something that's already broken. Declan had owed money, not to a bank, not to a regular creditor, not to anyone who would sit across from you and negotiate a payment plan. He'd owed money to Hale's organization, which was not a word she was supposed to say out loud, apparently. But everyone in certain rooms in this city seemed to already know. 3 years ago. A bad investment that Declan had been certain was going to turn their luck around, because Declan was always certain about things that turned out to be catastrophes. He'd taken a loan. He'd defaulted. He'd borrowed from somewhere else to cover it, compounded the problem, and spent the years since doing what Declan always did when he was in over his head, avoiding it until it couldn't be avoided anymore. How much? Nessa asked. Declan told her. She set down the rag she was still holding. She looked at her brother. He couldn't look back. Declan, how long have you known? About the timeline, 3 weeks. About the full amount? He exhaled through his nose. 2 years. 2 years. She'd lent him money 18 months ago for what he said was a housing deposit. She'd been saving for a new commercial oven. She didn't say any of that. She turned to the man who had been standing silently near the door this entire time, watching her process this with an expression that gave nothing away. "What do you want?" she said. Not a question, more like an accounting. Roman Hale looked at her for a moment before he answered. Not in the way men sometimes looked at her, cataloging. This was different. It was evaluation, like he was figuring out what she was made of and whether it was worth his time. "Your brother can't pay what he owes," he said. His voice was even and unhurried. "The debt transfers. I don't have that kind of money." "I know." She waited. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 7. Her mother died 2 years ago." He paused. "My life requires certain arrangements for appearances, for her stability. I need someone who can manage a household, accompany me at public functions, and pass as my wife for the duration of those obligations. 18 months. After that, the debt is cleared, and you walk away with enough to pay off your business loan and rebuild." Nessa stared at him. "You're serious," she said. "I don't make proposals I'm not serious about. That's insane. It's a contract." He reached into his coat and set a folded document on her counter. Clean paper, typed text, the ordinary-looking architecture of something that wasn't ordinary at all. "Everything is in writing. What I expect. What you're owed in return. What neither of us is permitted to do to the other." She didn't touch it. "I have a son," she said. "He's 8. "I know." He said it without hesitation, which meant he'd already known before he walked in, which meant this hadn't been a coincidence or an impulse. He had come here having already learned the shape of her life. He would come with you. There's a school within 15 minutes of the house. It's a good school. She looked at her brother. Declan was studying the floor with the focus of a man memorizing the grain of hardwood. She thought about 2 years. She thought about the money she'd sent him for a deposit that apparently went somewhere else. She thought about how long she'd been explaining Declan to herself and whether she was done. Then she picked up the contract and read every word of it. She added 2 clauses before she signed. The first, he would never speak to her with contempt in front of her son. Not in anger, not in dismissal, not in any tone that Jonah might internalize as the way men were supposed to talk to women. The second, if at any point Jonah showed signs of distress that she attributed to the arrangement, she could remove him from the household with no penalty and no renegotiation of the debt. Roman read both additions without expression. Then he took the pen and initialed them. "Anything else?" he asked. She thought about it. "No coffee before 8, she said. "I don't function before 8. If you need me to be pleasant, you'll respect that." Something crossed his face. She wasn't sure what it was. It was gone before she could name it. 8, he said. Understood. She signed the contract. Declan left without meeting her eyes. Roman Hale put the document back in his coat, told her she had 1 week to close up the café and make arrangements, and walked out into the cold Portland morning like he was leaving a meeting that had gone exactly as planned. Nessa stood alone in Bean and Birch for a long time after the bell above the door stopped swinging. Then she went to the back room, sat down on the step stool she kept there for reaching the top shelves, and let herself be furious for exactly 11 minutes. Timed it, because Jonah would be done at school in 2 hours, and she needed to be someone who had things under control before he got home. She was not going to cry in front of her son about this. She was not going to cry at all. The house was in Seattle. Of course it was. Not Portland, not anywhere she already knew, because that would have been too easy. It was a large house in a neighborhood where the trees were old and the fences were high, and the cars in the driveways cost more than she'd borrowed to open the cafe. The house itself was gray stone and wide windows, modern but not aggressive about it, with a garden that looked like it had once been carefully tended and was now maintained by someone who knew what they were doing but without affection. The housekeeper's name was Gloria. She was 60, pragmatic, and delivered Nessa's orientation of the house, like a woman who had long since stopped being surprised by anything that went on inside it. The kitchen was here. The laundry was there. Mr. Hale ate dinner at 7 when he was home. which was not always. He had preferences about noise levels after 9. He did not discuss business at the table. "And the girl?" Nessa asked. Gloria's expression shifted, just slightly. "Mabel, where is she?" "Upstairs. She'll come down when she's ready." Mabel Hale was 7 years old with her father's gray eyes and her mother's apparent stubbornness, and she came down the stairs that first evening at approximately 7:43 p.m., moving with the careful deliberateness of a child who had learned to control what she could. She had dark hair cut in a straight line across her forehead. She was wearing pajamas with small foxes on them. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at Nessa with an expression of frank, unsentimental assessment. "You're not going to be my mom," she said. "No," Nessa agreed. "I'm Nessa. I'm going to be staying here for a while." Mabel considered this. "Did you bring your kid?" "He's upstairs right now. His name is Jonah." "Does he like dogs?" "He loves dogs." "Do you have one?" "No." "Dad says the house isn't ready for a dog." She said it in the specific tone of a sentence that had been repeated back to her many times. "I think the house is ready. I'm not sure Dad is." "What kind of dog do you want?" Mabel's expression shifted into something more cautious but not closed. "A big one," she said. "Big enough to sleep at the foot of my bed." "That's a good size," Nessa said. From upstairs came the sound of Jonah's feet on the floorboards, that particular rhythm she could identify anywhere. He appeared at the top of the stairs in his socks, took one look at the girl at the bottom, and said, "Do you have a Nintendo?" "No," Mabel said, "but I have a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle of the ocean." Jonah considered this. "That sounds hard." "It is." "Okay," he said, and came downstairs. Nessa watched them disappear toward the living room. Behind her, she heard footsteps, heavier, measured, and knew without turning around that Roman had come home. "She talked to you," he said. It wasn't quite surprise, more like a notation. She asked if Jonah liked dogs. A pause. "She doesn't talk to most people when she first meets them." "She wanted information," Nessa said. She wasn't being friendly. She was being strategic. She turned to look at him. "She's exactly like you." Something she couldn't read moved across his face again. He looked past her toward the living room, where the low voices of their children had already settled into the particular rhythm of two people working on something together. "Dinner's at 7, he said, and walked past her toward his office. The first month was a negotiation conducted entirely without words. Roman Hale moved through his own house like a man who had designed it for efficiency rather than comfort, and efficiency was what he got. He left early, he returned late. At dinner, he asked Mabel about her day and listened with complete attention, which surprised Nessa. She'd expected distraction, the half-present performance of a busy man. Instead, he asked follow-up questions. He remembered things she'd mentioned the previous week. When Mabel said her art teacher had criticized the way she'd colored a sky, Roman said, "Was the teacher wrong?" and waited for Mabel's actual answer rather than offering a comfortable one. He was, in the specific area of parenting his daughter, a better father than Nessa had prepared herself to find. With Nessa, he was formal, correct. He addressed her schedule when necessary. He did not speak to her with contempt. She watched for it, cataloging every interaction, and he didn't. What he did instead was something harder to name. He treated her like someone who was present, whose input was relevant, whose opinion he might actually be interested in, and then he walked away before anything could develop from that. She had a role to play at public functions, and she played it. She attended 2 dinners in the first month, wearing clothes she would never have chosen for herself. Not because they were tasteless, but because they were the kind of clothes that communicated a specific kind of authority she didn't particularly feel. She stood beside Roman and shook hands and answered questions about how they'd met. Briefly, the story was brief and vague by design, and watched men around him calculate exactly what kind of man he was and decide not to push on anything. Jonah thought they were living with Mom's new business partner, which was technically not a lie. And he was happy in his new school and had decided that Mabel was his best friend, which Mabel accepted with slightly more dignity than Jonah's open enthusiasm, but accepted nonetheless. This was not what Nessa had expected. She'd expected to be miserable. She'd been prepared for misery. Misery she could manage. What she hadn't prepared for was the Wednesday in February, when Mabel came home from school in tears over something a girl had said about her mother, and Roman was still an hour away, and Nessa sat on the floor of Mabel's room and talked to her without script or plan, just talked because she knew what it was to grieve someone out loud, and she wasn't going to let this child do it alone. She didn't tell Roman about it afterward. It wasn't his to know. But he seemed to know anyway, because the next morning he came down to the kitchen before 8. She was still on her first cup, and set a small paper bag on the counter beside her. "There's a bakery 2 blocks east," he said. "The cardamom knots are worth the walk, but they sell out by 9. He left before she could respond. She opened the bag. Cardamom knot still slightly warm, exactly the kind of pastry she would have set aside at Bean and Birch for someone who needed something that required no explanation. She ate it standing at the counter and didn't let herself think about what it meant. The thing about a contract is that it assumes the people who signed it will remain who they were when they signed it. It doesn't account for February, for cardamom knots. For the night in March, when the power went out during a storm, and the 4 of them ended up playing cards by flashlight in the living room, and Roman Hale laughed. Actually laughed, not the polite performance of laughter she'd seen at dinner parties. At something Jonah said, and the sound was so unguarded that Nessa had to look away. She told herself she was tired. She told herself this was what happened when you spent 18 months in close proximity to another person. You started to see them in dimensions they hadn't volunteered. She told herself a lot of things. What she didn't tell herself, because she wasn't ready, was that she'd started watching the door at 7 o'clock. That she'd started noticing when he was in the room and when he wasn't. That she'd started doing the specific calculus of is this a good idea, and answering herself with detailed lists of reasons why it wasn't, which is a thing you do when you already know the answer and are hoping to talk yourself out of it. The night everything shifted was a Thursday in April. Mabel had a fever. Not serious. 101. Manageable. The pediatrician on the phone said rest and fluids and check back if it climbed. But she was miserable in the specific way sick children are miserable, wanting comfort and unable to articulate exactly what kind. Roman had been in a meeting he couldn't leave until Nessa texted him. He arrived home at 9, still in his jacket, and went straight upstairs without acknowledging Nessa in the hallway. She heard his voice through the door, not the words, just the tone, which was different than any tone she'd heard him use before. Lower, quieter. The particular register you reach for when someone needs to feel less alone. She went downstairs to make soup she hadn't been asked to make. He came down an hour later. She heard him in the kitchen doorway before she turned around. "She's asleep," he said. "Good." A pause. "You didn't have to stay up. I was awake anyway." He came in and sat down at the kitchen table, which he almost never did after 9. He looked like a man who had spent the evening being afraid of something and was only now allowing himself to stop. She ladled soup into a bowl and put it in front of him without asking, and he looked at it and then at her and didn't say anything. "She's going to be fine," Nessa said. "It's just a fever. Kids get them. I know. You don't look like you know." He was quiet for a moment. "Her mother had a fever," he said. 3 weeks before the diagnosis. It looked like nothing. It was everything. Nessa sat down across from him. She didn't say she was sorry. She'd never liked that as a response to grief. It was too reflexive, too automatic. It plugged the space without filling it. She just sat, and he seemed to understand that she wasn't going anywhere, because his shoulders came down by about half an inch. "What was her name?" Nessa asked. "Catherine." He said it carefully, like something that was still fragile and might not survive careless handling. She was funny, sharper than anyone gave her credit for. Mabel gets that from her. Mabel has good instincts about people. She does. He turned the soup bowl in his hands. "She decided you were acceptable within 24 hours. That's a record. She wanted to know if Jonah liked dogs. She always leads with the important questions. It was the most he'd talked to her, not at her, not around her, not in the proximity of her, but to her, in the particular way that assumed she was a person rather than a feature of the arrangement. She was not going to do anything about that. She was absolutely not going to do anything about that. She found out about Declan in May. Not by accident. Roman told her, deliberately, which she realized afterward was a choice he had made, which meant he'd thought about the alternative and decided she deserved to know. Her brother had not simply accumulated debt through bad investments and worse judgment. He had made an arrangement with a competing organization 3 months before coming to Nessa, and the debt he'd owed Roman's people had been used as leverage in that arrangement. Her brother had, in essence, offered up his sister's café as collateral in a deal that would benefit himself considerably and damage Roman's operations considerably more. When Roman had come to her that November Tuesday, he hadn't come to collect a debt. He'd come to remove her from a situation that was about to become dangerous in the least damaging way available to him. The marriage contract wasn't extraction. It was, in its strange, cold, contractual way, protection. Nessa sat in the garden and was very still for a long time. Then she said, out loud to no one in particular, "Declan, you absolute coward," and felt something she'd been carrying for 6 months finally name itself. She wasn't sad. She wasn't devastated. She was furious in the clean, clarifying way of someone who has finally stopped making excuses for a thing that has no excuse. Roman found her there an hour later. He sat down on the garden bench with about 3 feet of space between them and didn't speak first, which she was beginning to understand was something he did. He created space and let her choose how to fill it. "You could have just told me," she said. "You wouldn't have believed me." She thought about November, about the fear on Declan's face, about her own certainty that she knew her brother. "No," she said. "Probably not. I needed you to come willingly. You needed me to sign a contract thinking I was saving someone who was already selling me." Yes. He didn't apologize for the method. She found she didn't want an apology. An apology would have required her to say it was fine, and it wasn't fine. It was what it was. Nessa. She looked at him. "I could have left your brother to resolve it himself. I didn't. Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you'd built something," he said. "The cafe. The life. It wasn't fair. A lot of things aren't fair." "No," he said. "But some of them can be fixed." She looked at the garden. Someone had planted irises along the back wall, the purple-blue kind that showed up without warning and made you forget whatever you'd been thinking about. "I want to reopen Bean and Birch," she said. "Eventually. When this is over, I know. I want enough left over to hire someone, so I'm not doing everything alone. That's manageable, and I want a dog." She heard him shift. "Mabel's been patient long enough. She's been strategic and mature about it, and I think she deserves a dog." A silence. Then, almost very quietly, "Large enough to sleep at the foot of her bed?" That was the specification, yes. She heard it again then, that sound, the laugh he didn't perform, the one that came out without his permission. It lasted only a moment, but it was there. The arrangement was supposed to end in June, 18 months from signing. Nessa had the date marked in her phone with no label, just the date, the way you mark something you keep returning to without quite being able to explain why. She thought about it as May became June. She thought about Portland, about Bean and Birch, about the life she'd run toward when Jonah's father left and everything felt like it was ending. She thought about Jonah, who called Mabel his best friend and had stopped asking when they were going home. She thought about cardamom knots and card games during power outages, and a man who asked his daughter follow-up questions and had once described his dead wife with the care of someone keeping a fire lit in the wind. She thought about who she'd been when she walked into her own cafe in November, and she thought about who she was now, and she thought about the distance between those two people, and whether it was the kind you crossed back over, or the kind that meant something else. On the 14th of June, 4 days before the end date, she sat down across from Roman Hale at the kitchen table, which was where the real conversations happened in this house, she'd learned. Not the dining room, not his office, the kitchen, where everything was slightly imperfect and nothing was performed. "I want to renegotiate," she said. He looked up from the document he'd been reading. "The contract ends in 4 days," she said. "The debt is cleared. That's what we agreed." She put her hands flat on the table, a habit she had when she needed to stay grounded. "I'm not asking you to extend the arrangement. I'm asking you to end it and start something else." "Something else," he repeated. "You know what I mean. I want you to say it." She looked at him. He looked back, and his face had that quality it sometimes had, stripped of the armor he wore everywhere except in this kitchen at this hour, something underneath that was neither performance nor strategy. "I'm not interested in contracts," she said. "I'm not interested in arrangements. I spent 18 months learning the shape of you, and I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen just because the paperwork says it's over." A pause. "You're aware this is complicated. I'm a single mother who agreed to a fake marriage to save a brother who was actively betraying me," she said. "I have a high tolerance for complicated." Something that was not quite a smile. "Nessa, don't say it's a bad idea. I already know all the reasons it's a bad idea. I wasn't going to say that." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she noticed, the way she'd been noticing things about him for months, that his hands were warm. "I was going to say that Mabel is going to be insufferable about being right." "She told you?" "She told Gloria, who told me. She said, and I'm quoting, 'Nessa looks at Dad the way the neighbor's cat looks at the bird feeder. Patient. She's 7. She's terrifyingly perceptive." Nessa exhaled. It came out almost like a laugh. "She gets that from you." He turned her hand over in his, looking at it like he was thinking about something. Then he looked up. "What do you want?" he asked, genuinely, without agenda, the way he asked Mabel. "To stay," she said. "Not because of a contract. Because I'm choosing to." He was quiet for a moment. "The dog first," he said. "Mabel should have the dog before anything else gets renegotiated. She's been strategic and patient, and she deserves to have the first good thing." Nessa looked at him. "You've been listening to me. I've been listening to you since November," he said. "You tend to be right about the things that matter." 3 years later, Nessa stood in a café that was not Bean and Birch, but was, in every way that mattered, its descendant. Larger. 2 locations, one in Seattle, one in Portland. The Portland one, run by the barista, she'd trained before any of this happened. She'd kept the name. She'd kept the imperfect pastries set aside for the people who needed something without explanation. Jonah was 11. Working through his allotted 30 minutes of screen time with the focused expression of someone who had learned to negotiate with his mother and knew where the limits were. Mabel was 10, reading at the counter on the stool she'd claimed as hers, occasionally offering opinions about the music Nessa had chosen for the morning playlist. Mabel had opinions about most things. Nessa had come to rely on them. The dog was named Professor because Jonah had insisted, and Mabel had agreed on the condition that he never be called Prof F, only the full title, always with the gravity it deserved. He was large, gray-muzzled going on 3 years in, and he slept at the foot of Mabel's bed with the comfortable authority of someone who had found exactly the right place. Roman came in at 9:15, which was after 8 and therefore acceptable. He set a small paper bag on the counter beside Nessa, and she opened it without looking, because she already knew. "Cardamom nut," he said. "Still worth the walk? Still worth the walk." She ate it standing at the counter and let herself think about November, about the girl who'd built something entirely hers and been afraid of losing it. She thought about what she'd been protecting then, and what she was protecting now, and how the shape of it had changed. Not smaller, not simpler, but wider, rooted differently, in soil that had required 2 people to dig. She hadn't saved Declan. She wasn't sure Declan could be saved in the way she'd always hoped, and she'd stopped making that her responsibility. She'd called him twice in 3 years, said what she needed to say, and left the door open at the width she could manage. Some things didn't resolve neatly. Some debts weren't the kind that cleared, but some things did. Some choices held. "Jonah wants to learn to make croissants," she told Roman. "Will he be patient enough?" "No. He'll be terrible at it for 6 weeks, and then he'll get it, and then he'll be unbearable about it." "I'll look forward to the 6 weeks." She looked at him. He was watching Mabel read that particular attention he gave her, the kind that didn't crowd, that just stayed present in case it was needed. "I didn't know," Nessa said quietly, "when I signed that contract. What I was walking into, neither did I. You think you did. I thought I was making a pragmatic arrangement." He turned to look at her. "I was not accounting for the coffee requirement before 8, or the way you defend imperfect pastries. Or the fact that you sat on Mabel's floor in February and didn't tell me about it because you understood it wasn't mine to manage. It wasn't, no, he said. But I needed someone who understood that. I didn't know I needed it until you were already doing it. From the corner stool, Mabel looked up from her book. Are you two being emotional again? We're having a conversation, Nessa said. Same thing. She went back to reading. It's fine. Professor likes it when you're happy. He sleeps better. Jonah looked up from his screen. Is the cardamom knot thing from the bakery? Can I have one next time? If you're up before 9, Roman said. Jonah made a face that suggested this was an unreasonable condition and returned to his game. Nessa finished the last of the knot and looked at the café. Her café, this version of it, this wider thing, and felt something she'd thought she'd outgrown. Not the naive kind, the kind that assumed things would work out because they were supposed to. This was different. This was earned. Built out of one bad contract and a brother's betrayal and a 7-year-old who led with the important questions and a man who listened before he spoke, and cardamom knots left without ceremony on the kitchen counter. Not perfect. Not easy. Not the life she'd been protecting in November when she thought protection meant keeping everything exactly as it was. Better than that. Chosen. Held on to with both hands. That made all the difference.